Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Wonderful. So I'm talking on the shifting sands of global trade, and I have to say this is the first time in my entire career where the title of the presentation was actually given to me by the organizers rather than me giving it to them. But I want to congratulate them. They absolutely hit the target. It's a fantastic topic to be talking about at the moment. And I will be stressing, unfortunately, why you shouldn't build your castle on top of shifting sands. So let's press straight on. This is a quote from Star Wars. I don't know if you've seen this particular Star Wars movie. It's quite old now. I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere. And people say the same thing about me. But one thing we have to understand about trade policy and sand is that it can be an irritant. I could talk for an hour about this, but I won't. That trade can be wonderful, and it can make you richer. It can also make you poorer. It can bring us together. It can also drive us apart. And it can solve geopolitical problems, and it can create them. It's a damn shame, as this guy's singing in America, but it does, and we have to accept that. I guess maybe we'll talk about that more on the panel later. And certainly over the past couple of years, particularly for Australia, the sand that we were standing on started to turn into quicksand. And a lot of that has been predicted by myself and my team. These are some of the reports that we've published over the past 6 or 7 years on this topic. Some of you might have heard me talking on them. So, we're not being caught by surprise by any of this. But what we have to tell you now is that there's a lot more sand blowing towards us, very, very aggressively. I mean, we've got headlines like this: US retreat from free trade, even stronger, Republicans and Democrats are falling for the false allure of autarky. I think that one's a bit too strong. But it's getting closer and closer, and sandier, in that the Financial Times is noticing that the next emerging wave of politicians in America, who aren't in power yet, but are rising up, they want to completely rebuild American capitalism. And they want to get rid of the trade deficit completely. So there are lots of things they want to do, but one of them is no longer run a trade deficit and use whatever policy levers they have to use to make sure that they don't have one. Now that would turn world trade on its head for everybody. And it's just an indication of which way the sands and the winds are shifting and blowing. And it's not only America. The red line there, those are Chinese exports of cars to the world. Europe, which makes lots of cars too, has immediately decided it's going to respond with tariffs. So the free traders are now protectionist because they don't want to buy from somebody else. And China, well, they're not much of a free trader anyway, as we know. They're looking at shifting reliance on iron ore from Australia to Africa over time. They'll get there. They're also starting to grow food in public parks and doing whatever they can to stop buying from abroad as much as possible. Expect much more of that going forward. If we look at a broader range of commodities, not all of them are food, of course, but we can see that there are more and more supply restrictions being put in place. I'm not going to let you have X. That's the opposite of a tariff. You're not trying to keep things out, you're trying to keep things in. But it still absolutely shifts those sands of global trade, and it doesn't help us at all. Now the WTO is worried enough about that, the World Trade Organization, that they're now talking about fragmentation of global trade into allied blocs. Well, again, any of you who have heard me speaking will know that I was saying the same thing in 2016 and 2017. So congratulations, WTO. You finally got my report in your inbox. But they do have genuine reason to be concerned, okay? And the graphics have been completely screwed up on this one. Don't know why all the pictures have shifted off the screen. That's not how they're supposed to be. But there are data to back this up. Oh, dearie me. This has definitely gone wrong. Thank you, technical guys. The BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, they've done a deep data dive looking at who sells what to who around the world. And the long and the short of it is, they've found out that supply chains have already shifted, largely between the US and China. They've got longer. But what's happened is a middleman has appeared between the US and China. So China exports goods to Vietnam, Vietnam adds value, and then they go on to the US. So we still have roughly the same pattern of global trade, but with middlemen in Southeast Asia appearing. Now, if you're an optimist, you'll turn around and say, well, there you go, we didn't really decouple at all. And if you're a realist like me, you'll say there is much, much, much more decoupling to come because we've just started. And on that front, everyone thinks that the Americans are driving this, and they're not. It's actually the Chinese who are driving it as much as anybody. And if you look here at the two headlines on the left and the right, one of them is a year old now, over a year old. We are seeing attempts, and I stress only attempts for the moment, to try and run out the sands of time on the US dollar and the global trading system as we understand it today. And any of you who export and receive US dollars, that means you. Now, part of that is just because it is time for a change. If you look at the share of world GDP, the red area, which is emerging markets, including China, is getting bigger. And the blue area, which is the G7, and the light blue area, which is you guys, is relatively smaller. We like to think we set the rules, and we're the majority. No, we're actually a minority, and we're shrinking every year relative to the others. So yeah, maybe it is time for a change on that front. But it's also linked to the shifting sands politically and geopolitically, in that the expansion of the Brics alliance into now the Brics 11, and you can see the countries there on the map on the right, is deliberately being done, in their own words, to try and change the world order. Politically, economically, financially, even militarily. That's the game that's being played. And to think that we can continue to stand still on the sands while it's shifting underneath us is quite naive. Now, I want to show you this chart, or this map here. You're probably familiar with this. That's China's Belt and Road Initiative, showing how it wants to link itself through Central Asia. And you'll notice Iran there on the map, by the way. I'll come back to that later. Through the Middle East, to Europe, and down into Southeast Asia, down to Australia, and down to the People's Republic of Victoria nearby. You've got the Russian proposal, which is to link India through Iran to Europe. That's how they want to see trade flowing. They call that the North-South Trade Corridor. And then we have this one, which was going to be called the India-Middle East Economic Corridor, to link India through Dubai, through Saudi Arabia, through Jordan, through Israel, to Europe. That just got blown out of the water for now by recent events, which I will be coming back to in a moment. Now let's, before we get there, focus on this Brics 11 group. They're big economies with a very, very big population. But if you look at the intra-Brics 11 trade, so how much they trade with each other, that's the red slice of that particular chart. Bugger all, as we call that in economic terms. Absolutely bugger all. They don't do very much with each other. The rest of the world does a lot. The OECD, within the OECD, which includes Australia, does a lot. So bear that in mind. But here's where it starts to get technical. There are a few technical charts here, and this is the most technical of all of them. What they are trying to do initially within the Brics 11 and within groupings of other countries who join in with them is to move from normal trade in dollars to bilateral trade, which effectively is priced in US dollars, but becomes barter. I'll swap you X for Y and A for B to avoid using dollars completely so they can't be subject to sanctions. Obviously, that disrupts trade. And if you look at China trade with Latin America and China trade with the Middle East, you can see what they export and import from each other. And you could see what they might net out. For example, China would largely net out commodities, both hard and soft, from those regions and say, well, we'll send you mobile phones, televisions, shoes, for example. We'll price them in dollars and we'll just swap. At the same time, they are hoping eventually to shift to trading in renminbi rather than pricing in dollars and swapping things. That's effectively going to be done via the Chinese central bank, the PBOC, doing trade commodity finance, TCF, which we're all about at Rabobank, in renminbi. And they're already offering what we call swap lines, which is, here's some of our money, we'll give it to you, you give us your money, to finance that going on. And they hope, over time, they can build enough scale that the trade will eventually shift from dollars completely, even in theory, to renminbi. And we can see that happening here. This is the global share of trade commodity finance by currency. And if you look on the left axis, China has gone from 2% to 4.5% since the invasion of Ukraine. Still very small, but it's going through the roof. The US dollar on the right-hand axis, that's come down from around 88 to 84. So it's still the king, but it's slipping a little bit. And if we keep seeing that renminbi going up, that tells you more and more countries are starting to just move off of the network we use at the moment. Now, do you remember I showed you that red bar saying they don't do very much together, those countries? And here's another way of showing that. What I've got are the Brics 11 there. I think you can probably work out the acronyms of the countries: Argentina, Brazil, China, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, and the UAE. And at the end, the OECD, which includes you guys. And it's how much trade they do with each other as a percentage of their total trade. So the higher you go up the mountain, the more you're doing with that grouping. And what you can see is the OECD is the king. All the Brics 11 still do more trade with the OECD as a percentage than they do with themselves. So it's another way of showing the same thing. So you might think, well, therefore they can't separate from us. They can try, but we're too interconnected in terms of trade. At which point, I go back and I think of Shakespeare, because I'm a POM, I'm thinking of Shakespeare 24/7. If you remember The Merchant of Venice, for those of you who read that at school when you were young, and the pound of flesh, you can cut a pound of flesh off your body and it will be painful and you'll live and you'll be okay. But there are certain areas where if you cut a pound of flesh, you don't walk away from it, no matter how good the surgeon is. That, I believe, is what the Brics 11 are trying to do. They're aiming for the pound of flesh. Because if you look again here, this is upstream exports. And when I say upstream, I'm talking commodities. So again, you can see some trade there. For example, Russia, China, Brazil, Russia. These ones are big in terms of commodity flows, and we know that in our business. But commodities flow from the Brics 11 to the OECD. Energy. We're talking energy in particular. We still rely on their energy, and they know it. So that's a real pressure point. And we've lost all the text on this one completely. Okay, fantastic. So you saw a brief flash on the screen, which was supposed to be my bullet points. It's a good job I've memorized them. And the point is this: if they control all the energy, or are the key share of energy going into Western economies, that gives them a pressure point over us. I think we feel that day in, day out, and we're going to see a lot more of it shortly for reasons I'll explain. But what's also important to understand is that the likelihood is, as they make this transition from one currency to another, it won't be done in paper money, it will be done in digital money, what we call a central bank digital coin, a CBDC, not ACDC, much as I love ACDC, CBDC. And when you have a CBDC, it's effectively electronic programmable money that comes from the central bank. And you can allocate where it goes and for what, and you can turn it on and off with a switch. It's not how money works, not how we're used to it in the West. So if they do that, you can have a fistful of dollars, absolutely, but you'll be buried in the sand of another group who can literally plan their economy. Here's enough money that's going to go from here to there just for this and for nothing else, or it turns itself off. So you can plan what you want to do. And the West, well, we don't do planning very well, do we? Look at Aussie infrastructure. So, it's really not a fair fight. Oh, here they go. They've come back. Fantastic. So it's not just about the PBOC doing CNY TCF. It's going to be this CBDC. China is calling it the M-Bridge system. That's what they're calling it. It will allow for clearing, so settlement of currencies within this Brics group. It supports state industrial policy, and it will be a parallel system to the banking system called SWIFT that we use. So we're talking a parallel system. Now, what does that mean for a farmer? Well, here's a bar of chocolate, yum yum. Obviously, you have inputs to go into that. Oil, diesel, cocoa, palm oil, sugar, nuts, and a lot of E numbers that I don't like. What if all of those inputs were in this new Brics digital currency? So in order to get all the inputs, you've got to have that digital currency, but you don't have it because you're in the West and you're using the Aussie dollar or the Kiwi dollar or the US dollar on the SWIFT system. And what if there's no exchange rate between the two because of political reasons? Well, you break the bar of chocolate in half. You have to have parallel bars of chocolate, parallel systems. And that's effectively what we're seeing. I could talk for an hour on this too. Part of what's happening is the US banking system is huge, much bigger than people realize. It's like 10 times the size of the Australian economy. It's about $20 trillion. But the amount of dollars that flow offshore, US dollars that flow offshore, is around 80 to 100 trillion. There's an entire parallel global economy there. And the Brics countries are saying, we don't want to be using the US dollar in a parallel economy outside the US because we don't like the US. We want to use commodities instead of the dollar. We want to trade with each other based on what we have, which is stuff. And we want to value that in a new currency that we trade with each other and eventually force the West to take from us. That's the game plan. I'm not saying it's easy to achieve. I'm not saying they can do it at all, but that's what they want to do. And so in order to push back against that, and trust me, the West will push back against that very, very hard. One thing that you can expect to see, and I've been predicting for quite some time, is that the US will raise interest rates. Because you can say on one hand, I've got a ship full of oil, or I've got a warehouse full of this particular commodity, and if the price keeps going up and up, why wouldn't you hold that? It's an accumulating asset in terms of value. But if you raise your interest rate to 5.5%, like the Americans have, maybe even 6%, that's 6% risk-free, no need to store anything or worry about mice or leaks. And so the commodity price is less attractive, relatively. And so we expect to see higher rates for longer, for many reasons, not just due to inflation. And some of them will be to push down the value of Brics 11 currencies, which is happening, they are collapsing. And to push down commodities, which they're trying to do, and to hit these shadow banks which operate offshore, which then are not regulated by the Americans. And importantly, if you get a crisis outside the US from people who have borrowed dollars and can't repay them, don't expect any help. The Americans are going to say, what have you done for me lately? Rather than bail you out. Here are the Brics 11 FX, based at 100 in the year 2010. The Chinese currency in red is doing reasonably well, and that's not doing well at all. And the Brazilian currency has held up well in the last 2 or 3 years. Everybody else is going down the pan. So this game is already being played, even if we don't want to join the dots to see it. And as I said, if half the castle starts to crumble on the back of that volatility that we see in the Brics countries, why would the US step in and say, well, we'll help you out, here are more dollars? No. Emerging markets, particularly ones that aren't friendly with the US, could have a real crisis, and they're all on their own if that does happen. So I'm starting to come towards a conclusion and more recent news. The first key point is this: nothing can replace the dollar globally. Don't for 1 second think I'm selling you a future where we all use a digital renminbi and that's the way the world will be. It will not happen in our lifetimes, or at all. You can't replace that castle, which is the US dollar, internationally. But you can stomp on it. That's not replacing it, that's just stomping on it. The system can crumble. Countries can start to try and walk away. But in order to do so, they have to decouple themselves from the US dollar economy and from the economies of other people who still use the US dollar. And that implies enormous, enormous disruption. And we've been here before. Some of you may have seen this slide before with slightly different backgrounds. In the 1930s, world trade broke down completely. Clearing broke down completely between the different political blocks, and I stress political blocks here. You couldn't convert one currency into another. As a result, supply chains had to physically readjust. No, can't trade with them. There's no exchange rate between the currencies. Well, of course, it ended up in World War II, but we were already heading there. This was just a precursor to it. So we've been there before. Now, it's much more complicated today because our supply chains are largely intra-industry, not inter-industry. We're all connected together. So again, if you're an optimist, you'll say it can't happen because we're stitched together. And if you're a pessimist like me, you say, well, we'll rip out the stitches. That's what some people want to do. And the West is starting to see this. We are starting to see policy reverse. For example, we're saying, thank you very much, we don't need housing bubbles. What we do need is factories. We need to produce stuff, not overpriced housing. At this point, the Australian Secret Service would drag me off stage because, that's absolutely anathema to say in Australia. But we are seeing countries, even Australia this week, from Albo, talking about 5 billion for cybersecurity, 2 billion into critical minerals to move up the value chain. We are seeing friendshoring, nearshoring, onshoring. The West is very painfully, slowly taking a leaf out of the Chinese playbook. And we've done analysis that suggests 28 million jobs will leave China as a result and go to other countries. Not all in the West by any means, but around the world. And that's a worse deindustrialization, relatively, than the US saw vis-a-vis China and Mexico. So that will hollow them out. They'll probably automate to fight against it, but it still leaves a lot of unemployment if so. But it can get worse than that, and now I turn to more recent events. We're all aware that if you want some goods, sometimes you try and take them. And China and the US obviously have a tug of war over semiconductors or chips and Taiwan. I think everyone here is aware of that. This headline, by the way, isn't from the tabloids, it's from the financial press. But it's not only that story. There are guns in the sand. In Africa, for example, we've had 4 coups this year, with Russia helping them all of them toppling pro-Western, pro-European governments. Very corrupt, stupid governments, but they're not going to be replaced by a government that isn't corrupt or isn't stupid, unfortunately. It will just be anti-Western. And of course, these were the events of nearly 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago tomorrow. Shocking, shocking events in the Middle East, which are now changing global economic trading patterns at an accelerated rate. That's what you call a shifting sand. Because in the Middle East, what we see is a very, very worrying risk of very, very worrying escalation. All the countries there could potentially be dragged in and more. Israel is fighting Hamas already. Shortly, it's already fighting Hezbollah. We have Iranian-backed militias in Yemen, in Syria, and Iraq, which are all starting to fire, or likely to fire soon. And behind them all, we have Iran. And the US is openly warning Iran, if you make trouble in the region, you'll know about it. Iran, of course, can easily respond, not just with direct attacks, but by making sure oil and gas can't flow easily out of the region. And if that happens, energy prices could double from here. Double. And you can't say, well, they'll come back down again quickly, because who from? Only Russia. And Russia, of course, would have every incentive to turn the taps off too, to push prices even higher. That gives it more money to fight the war in Ukraine, and the US would be distracted on 2 fronts. And if it's distracted on 2 fronts, who's minding the shop in Asia? As we speak, there are real tensions between China and the Philippines over a small island which belongs to the Philippines, which China claims as its. And ships are literally bumping into each other. And the US has openly warned if one of them sinks and sailors die, the US Navy has to go to the South China Sea to protect the Philippines. So really, the stakes are sky high, the risks are evident, and they're very, very fat. energy prices would soar. Even the Suez Canal in some scenarios could be blocked, which means goods can't flow through easily to Europe. So yeah, about as bad as it gets. I'm not saying it will happen, but it's far more likely than people are thinking right now. And so to conclude, industrial supply chains are already shifting, but you guys aren't in industry. Soft supply chains, they can shift less because where you can grow things obviously is fixed to a certain degree. But they're going to shift with politics in terms of who does and doesn't buy from whom. Institutional shifts in terms of which currency you use and which banking system you use, they're going to complicate commodity trading. If we start getting commodities priced in different currencies, it's going to be a massive headache for the global system. And so let me simplify it for you. Stay in your lane. And I think you know which lane it is. It's already been chosen for you by AUKUS. But keep your eye on where the sand is shifting most dramatically and most violently. And that's the Middle East. Thank you very much.